Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Today we're going to be talking about the differences between an original Mosin and a refurbished Mosin. Now, before we get into this too much, we kind of have to define what our terms are, alright? So original is going to mean essentially the original state of that gun, or the last state that gun was used in a real military configuration. Generally, when we talk about refurbishments, we're talking about a scenario where the gun was used in a military setting, and then after that gun was done being used, that was set aside and then refurbished. So things like maybe the stock was redone, or the bluing was redone, or the muzzle was recrowned. There's all sorts of different things that it can mean. But for the sake of this video, we're going to be talking about original, meaning the last state that gun was actually used within a military context. So the gun is in a state where it was actually the same state it was when it was being used in a military context. Whereas a refurbished Mosin is going to be something where, I guess we could define it as a post-military use. Generally speaking, again, that's not 100%, but for the purposes of this video, that's what we're going to go with. So how do we tell the difference, all right? And what are some of the very common Mosins we see, and how are they associated with each type? So here we've got pretty standard 9130 rifle, okay? This is pretty much the Mosin you're most likely to encounter at any sort of place that sells things like this. Now, this particular guy, and pretty much all ones like this, are going to be refurbished guns, okay? What does that mean? Well, let's take a look here at some of the barrel markings, and I can give you a little bit better idea of what we're talking about here today. All right, so here we can see our barrel markings. Let me get my pointer, and in fact, I can even zoom in a little bit. So we have this big box right here. This is what we would call in America a refurbishment arsenal. So this particular one is located in modern day Riga, Latvia. This is arsenal number 7, this box here. And this military depot, essentially is what it was, would take Mosins and refurbish them. And we can see there's also this other marking here. There's another marking that tends to look like sort of like a crossed X or 2 hammers crossed. Kind of the same marking from a refurbishment factory. Now another way you can tell this was refurbished is it may have a different marking depending on the refurbishment depot. But pretty much all of the refurbishment depots should have put a marking like this. Now this is sideways. This looks like an N within a square. This is actually the Russian letter P, as in Papa. This indicates that a refurbishment was conducted on the rifle, and a shooting adjustment was made to the rifle. That's what this box indicates. So pretty much any Mosin you pick up, you're generally going to see one in this configuration where it's refurbished. But what did they actually do to this gun? Well, it can depend on the gun and the state it was in when it arrived at, in this case, arsenal number 7. But generally, they would receive either a new stock finish or a new stock altogether. This one definitely received a new stock at some point, because we can see this was made by the Ijev's factory, because we have our arrow and a triangle in 1942. But we have our late war / post-war escutcheons, these big metal escutcheons. Those were not around in 1942. So it's very possible that this stock was a replacement stock at some point. Now, there's further evidence of that if we look here at the back of the stock, right here. All right, so this is actually a separate refurbishment arsenal. This is actually located in Russia. So what came first, the stock or the actual refurbishment by arsenal number 7? Well, we're not really sure, but this gun has indications of 2 separate refurbishment depots. So this gun has definitely been places, even after the war. During the war, who knows? It probably wasn't very good, though. You can see this one has that really cool, iconic, rough wartime finish here. But there's another thing we can do to tell that this was refurbished, and this is going to be really the easiest indicator. We're going to go ahead and open up the bolt here, and you're going to look on the inside of the bolt channel. Now, I'm going to try to move it around in the lighting so you can see, but everything in here, it's all black. Just like the exterior, the finish on the inside is all black. Now, that definitely tells us that this gun has been refurbished, and part of that was that the gun was refinished, okay? The entire gun was reblued. So generally with these refurbished guns, and not just 9130s, you see this with M38s and M44s as well. The refurbished guns are going to have the inside of the bolt channel and all in here all blued. Okay, so combine that with the fact that we can see we have a rebluing all over the gun. We have this very nicely refinished stock. We can definitely tell that what we have here is in fact a refurbished Mosin. So this is going to cover the majority of Mosins you'll ever come across. They're going to be in this state. And that actually makes Mosins kind of interesting and rather unusual right off the bat, because Mosins that look really rough, kind of like battlefield pickup condition, you might say, are quite a lot less common than a really nice looking Mosin like this. So even though you might be attracted to a Mosin like this that looks really nice, this is way more common than one that looks really horrible. And the ones that look really horrible can often be more collectible, depending on what we're talking about. But collectability is kind of a subject for another video. Here, we're just trying to look at some of the differences. So now you kind of have a good understanding of what a refurbished Mosin looks like. So now let's contrast this with looking at an original Mosin. So let me set this guy to the side here. And I'm going to pull out our famous Mosin with, you guessed it, the penny stock. Look at that. All right, so here we have an original Mosin. Again, this is a 9130 rifle, just this exact same model like the one we just saw. But we can see this one looks a lot rougher, right? It doesn't have the nice finish on the stock. It's got a lot of dings and wear. We can see a lot of wear on the finish here. The finish also doesn't look black on this. Generally on those refurbished Mosins, it'll look just kind of like a flat black. Now, it can also be kind of glossy, but it'll look very dark, very black. This looks more like an actual bluing wood. It closer to a blue kind of gray color, but we can see there's a lot of finish wear on this rifle. And it's not just limited to the magazine either. If we flip this guy over here and take a look at some of the barrel markings, we can see here we have the same sort of scenario. Now, generally on these 9130 rifles, it seems that the serial number was actually stamped after the initial bluing was conducted on the gun. So in this case, we can kind of see that traces of that. It appears that's the case on this one. What we don't see is any sort of refurbishment arsenal logo or that adjustment shooting adjustment box. All right, now we can see here this is made in USSR is what it says. We'll come back to that in a second. But if we open up the bolt channel, just like we did on our last rifle, we're going to see a little bit of a different story. All right, so see how on the inside here there's no finish at all, right? This is what we would call in the white. No finish at all in here. This was not blued from the factory. So from all of this, we can infer this is an original Mosin. This is not a refurbished Mosin. But we already could have told you that without even really looking much at the gun, just by looking at this marking here. This marking tells us that this was imported sometime in the late 1950s, potentially even early 1960s in America, from Spain. This guy was used in the Spanish Civil War. And that makes sense because these weren't sent back to the Soviet Union after World War II or anything to be refurbished in the Soviet Union like that last rifle we saw was. So this escaped the refurbishment process. This guy's in the minority, so this is another reason this gun's actually pretty cool. So even though this gun looks kind of horrible, it's actually more collectible than the last one we just looked at because it's less common. Mosins are pretty weird, folks. All right, we can see all this finish wear and this cool, battlefield pickup style wear on this rifle, both on the wood and on the finish of the gun. So now you know what an original Mosin looks like. Okay, but from here, this can get a little bit more complicated. And there's actually different types of refurbishment that's been conducted to different Mosins by different countries. So now let's set this rifle aside. Ooh. And what I'm going to do now is show you a different kind of refurbished Mosin. Now here we're looking at a 9159. This has the 9130 rear sight, but it's been cut down into a carbine. And we can see on the barrel markings here, 1891/59. Now this is a much less common variant than a 9130, but these are also refurbished, sort of. Now on 9159s, you won't see those same refurbishment markings we saw on our first rifle. That shooting adjustment in the box thing. You won't see the different types of arsenal logos on here. So that's one way we can kind of infer from these that these were actually not refurbished in the Soviet Union. It's generally believed here in the West that these were created or refurbished in Bulgaria. And while the lack of markings doesn't necessarily point to Bulgaria, it does point to being sort of outside the mainstream Soviet Union. So like Russia or modern-day Latvia or modern-day Ukraine, where we would see all of those refurbishment arsenals. So this might actually be from the Balkan region. But we can see on 9159s, they generally have this really beautiful glossy finish that's just absolutely gorgeous. If you're looking for a Mosin that has a really nice finish, this is the one you want. These have much nicer finishes, right? These are very different finishes from the standard one, right? Remember, the one we looked at was pretty flat black. This is very glossy. So very different from your typical refurbished gun. But if we open the bolt channel again, look at that. We see all the black in there. So this has definitely been refinished. It didn't come this way from the factory, but it was refinished by somebody else. / refurbished. So the way I would put it is refinishing is kind of a subset of refurbishment. It's part of the process of refurbishment. But I have to be a little bit careful because a lot of times when we talk about a gun being refinished, it could actually mean that it was refinished by somebody here in America. Sometimes these guns didn't come in here in the best shape, and a lot of people here in America would refinish these rifles. But that's not original. That's not like a military thing. That's just somebody did that in their garage, or potentially. So that's why I like to make the distinction of refinishing and refurbishing. So since this was done in a military context, I'd call this a refurbishment. If Joe Schmo did this in his garage, I would call this a refinishing. So it's important to be able to define our terms, folks. You see, this guy has a really nice beach stock that was actually made in Czechoslovakia. Very strange gun. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's set this guy to the side, and now let's look at a different gun. Now, I know some of y'all are asking probably now, well, what about Finland? What about Finnish Mosins? Let's take a look at one. So here's sort of an oddball gun. This is a finished Mosin. This is actually an M91 produced by Tikkakoski. You can see our T in a triangle there in 1927. We can see our SA stamp here as well as our D, which means the throat has been adjusted for that D166 projectile that Finland is so famous for. This one's also kind of weird because it has a stepped barrel. But what we're interested here today is to figure out, are finished Mosins original or refurbished? And the answer to that one is, well, quite frankly, yes. It's both. So it really depends on the gun you're looking at. Now, we can see the finish on this one looks pretty nice. It's very shiny. It looks very nicely done. When I open up the bolt to check in the bolt channel, we can see here clearly this is not finished inside here. This is all in the white still. So it does appear this is the original finish added to this rifle by Tikkakoski, or whoever built this rifle and assembled the barrel to the receiver. But this does appear this is the original finish given to this rifle in 1927. So about 100 years old for a finished Mosin, and actually looks, well, pretty nice still. But not all finished Mosins are like this. A lot of finished Mosins, you'll open up the bolt and it'll be all blued inside of here. Finland did re-blue some guns. And I think a lot of that has to do with condition. If it had a lot of rust or other problems, I think they would generally just get rid of all of it and remove the entire finish and then just re-blue it all. But sometimes you'll see finished Mosins with the original finish. And it's not just the ones they actually made. This holds true for guns bought by Finland as well. So you'll see actual Russian M91s used by Finland that are both in the original state, original bluing, and also some that have been re-blued by Finland. And again, sometimes that's due to rust. That's been my assessment at least. But again, it depends on the rifle and really what they had or from a resource standpoint at the time. Maybe they wanted to re-blue all of them, and some of them they just couldn't really justify because of the war or because of lack of resources or whatnot. So finished Mosins, again, when we talk about refurbishment, they're really weird. You don't know what you're getting. They're a huge mixed bag. So this is just a few examples. I'm not going to go into every single example in this video because it would be hours and hours long. And let's face it, nobody really wants that. But I think this probably helps give a little bit better understanding to y'all of what exactly it means to have a refurbished versus original Mosin. So I hope you guys found this useful. If you have any questions, please let me know. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing, because we do all sorts of cool Mosin Nagant content like this here on the channel. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.